Freedom will always be a work in progress because there's an interplay between flow and fear that dictates the line that we draw for freedom. It dictates how much freedom we allow, both individually and culturally, nationally, globally, whatever. Freedom ends where instinct kicks in. Instinct is there because you can no longer handle the situation with freedom. You've become ungrounded. You've lost your sense of self in relation to other, and this isn't just humans. You can think of animals. It may be easier, in fact, for a little bit to think of it this way with animals, but they're free to move and interact and live and be as long as they're grounded in the scenario. Once that grounding is lost and we become fearful, so we've lost our sense of self in relation to other, which is very scary. We don't have that tie anymore. We don't know where we stand in relation to other. Now we're fearful. And that's the point in an animal where instinct kicks in. It's also the point in a human where either we choose to ground anyway or instinct kicks in. And instinct is pre-programming. It's just, you're going to do this, you're going to do this, you don't really have a choice in it. It just kicks in and it happens. And it's there to keep you alive. It serves a really good purpose. But for humans who are very complex, and create laws to try and allow as much freedom as possible, we allow it to the point where culturally we're not in a place of fear. Their individuals can be fearful in there, but where the overriding energy in the culture is not in a place of fear. And that moves and changes as we learn and grow and do new things and incorporate new people and new environments into our things, into what we're doing. That line changes. And you'll never have, in theory there's complete freedom, but there's never complete freedom because fear always kicks in at some point in time. And so our struggle with freedom is always where that fear is kicking in. And when you have people, building fear, it kicks in much sooner, and we're much more willing to give up our freedom because of that fear. And when you have people integrating all the knowledge that we have, taking a big picture look at everything, and quelling that fear and staying grounded, then we're much less likely to give up freedoms. So freedom is completely tied to fear, and there will always be a level at which fear kicks in. So freedom will always be a work in progress. And we can lose it in two ways. One is what I would call innocent fear, which is usually a lack of understanding of a scenario. I'll give an example in a second, but a lack of integrating all that we know into it. So we don't have to be in fear, but we are in fear, and it's relatively innocent. And the other one is for people who have gotten to a point in their life where they want to control others. Then fear is going to be the technique that they use to do it, especially in peaceful times. Because as soon as they get you afraid, you will give up your freedom. Unless you become more grounded. But assuming that you don't become more grounded, you will give up your freedom at that point. So, some examples. I think the virus, any virus, vaccines, this whole, that whole subject is definitely one where there's a lot of, semi-innocent fear around it. it's becoming less and less innocent because of all that we understand about nature and microbiome and how all of this stuff works. It's becoming hard to call that innocent fear, but in much of the population, it's innocent. And when you truly believe that that your health, that your life is at risk, that's the point at which the instinct kicks in, and then you want to grab onto something to feel like it kind of gives you a false sense that you still have control over life, that you can still make things happen. And if you think about that, outside of the virus, but just in life, that's the point at which you start yelling because it gets a reaction from the other person. So it gives you this false sense that you still have a tie. You still understand yourself in relation to other because you got a reaction from the other. And that scenario plays out in many different ways, but it's kind of the same principle at work everywhere. So the things like lockdowns and mandatory vaccines and all these things are really a grab for some kind of control in a fearful state. For some people, it is also based on a not fully integrated belief about how viruses work. And so then you get into this, and this is another reason why freedom is always a work in progress. You get into this, people are not free when they're being subjected to others, diseases and problems like that, right? But that depends on a particular understanding of how diseases work. It has especially viruses. Someday I'm going to talk a lot about viruses because there's some really intriguing information there. But when we culturally completely accept a certain belief about how viruses work, and when you integrate the entirety of human knowledge, and mainly when you integrate the principles of persistence, what I call the principles of persistence in nature. So why nature persists infinitely, nature as a whole, there are certain principles that enable that to happen. And so when you take those principles and apply them to our understanding of disease and viruses and things like that, it doesn't fit. It doesn't mesh our current understanding of it. And so that's another reason why freedom is always a work in progress, because most people are willing to give up their freedom in that regard because they're just plain scared. But some people are not scared. They believe they understand it without having integrated the entirety of knowledge. And their understanding leads to it is an infringement on others' freedoms to walk around with a disease caused by a virus. So that's just one example of how freedom is not, it's not cut and dry. It's not simple. In theory, it's simple. Freedom is a lack of constraint. But there are always constraints. There are always brakes on everything. And, for instance, we don't have the freedom to float. There's a constraint called gravity, right? And so we get it and the natural laws, but I would say emotion follows the same natural laws, and there are constraints on that too. So the point at which you can no longer maintain your sense of self in relation to other, and you lose your grounding, is the point at which you lose your freedom and instinct kicks in, or we create rules to kick in. So we are constantly having to battle not going backwards, because it's easy, once there's fear, it's easy to build more and more and more fear around it. It's very easy to do that. And people who seek power will always be trying to do that. So we're constantly battling that. But the other reason freedom is a work in progress is because when we are grounded, as soon as we become grounded in our current freedom, we see a new constraint that we couldn't see before because our focus was elsewhere. But now we're grounded in this. Now we see a new constraint that if we could get rid of that, we would have a new level of freedom, a new degree of freedom, if you want to talk about it that way. So there's always going to be something else that we can do to increase our freedom and thus our life. I always come back to Adrienne Bijan describing or defining life as movement with the freedom to change. And so increasing your life is very much about increasing the freedom to change, to adapt, to respond instantly to whatever is going on in the best way possible, given all that you know and feel and understand. So freedom will always be a work in progress. It's not a one-time deal. You don't fight for it, you get it, you got it 100%, and you're done. And as we know, we've never gotten it 100%. It's always incremental. We get a bunch, then we sit there, then we start losing it, which triggers stress around, which makes us get more, and then that cycle continues on and on. It can go the other direction too, but there's always a cycle of freedom going on, and it's always incremental, and there's always the fight not to go backwards, and there's always the drive to go forwards. But freedom will always be a work in progress. I think that's it. That's all I have to say today.